Greetings everyone, this is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever, and today's video is going to be a continuation concerning a video I did previously called Ivrim, Benei, Yisrael, Yehudim, Jews. Do they descend from Yadava Farmers? And this is Addendum 1. Just to recap the previous video, there was a claim that had been made essentially about this issue of claiming that, as the person wrote it, Hebrews were originally Yadava farmers, that essentially what they're saying is ancient Israelites were never in Egypt, but instead India, and Jews don't understand their own language. In text, again, this is kind of what it's alluded to by the person's claim, as well as Ashkenazi DNA RM124 comes from India. And what is important to note again about this person who made the claim is that they don't know Hebrew, Aramaic, or Akkadian, which is very important to analyzing such a topic. So here's where I think the basic starting point would have to be to respond to something like this, because one of the things I've noticed is that in the English language there are certain terms like the word Hebrew or Israelite that I think some people have taken to mean something different than maybe what it meant to some people about 100 years ago in English. Meaning, what I mean by that is saying that there are some people, when they use these terms, they are essentially separating the Jewish people from the terms, meaning that when they say Hebrews, they're talking about people that they kind of associate with someone else compared to like being the ancestors of Jewish people. As well as when they say Israelites, they're usually also talking in some levels to be people who are not Jewish, and in a way to try to separate the Jewish people out from that, which for me is perfectly fine. And I think that as Jews we should be using the original terminology that our ancestors used, which is native to our language, meaning the first one being Ivrim or Ivri, and also Benei Yisrael and Yehudim or Yehudi. These are the terms that are natural to the Hebrew language and are the correct ways to transliterate Hebrew words, for example. So the word Hebrew is, for example, some people think it's a transliteration in some cases when it's actually not. The word Ivri or Ivrim or Ivrim is a transliteration of what's actually written in Hebrew, as well as Benei Yisrael is a transliteration of how you write what you see in the blue on the next line, and Yehudim, Yehudi, is how you would translate the terms, in the darker blue on the bottom. So I think this is important, and I think when I do a summary of these addendums, that's when I'll kind of cover why this is important. So concerning what I would call debunk number 4, a continuation of the previous video, I got a response to that video, and I want to present that and also basically debunk the information that was there. So the response basically says the following. Let us take one point first. Jacob was a shepherd, but Joseph settled them in Goshen. Here they became farmers, maybe also during shepherdry on the side. They recall watermelons and cucumbers. They make cities of Pithom and Ramesses. They put blood on doorposts during Passover. Now, the one thing I will say about this particular comment is that it doesn't have any, I will say, scholastic or, it doesn't make a lot of scholarly sense in terms of how it's worded. And it could be just the way the person wrote it. The problem with this is the following. As we mentioned in the previous video, the claim was that they were like farmers from Yadava, a particular region in India. Now, the problem with that, as we mentioned before, is that they, in the written text itself, and this is the person's claim, was trying to use the written text as they have it in English to try to make this claim, not like taking it from the Hebrew text. So as I showed in the previous video in the Hebrew text, that's a claim opposite of what's being claimed in the Torah. In the Torah, it actually mentions that Yaakov and all of his sons were basically ro'et son, that they were like shepherds. And it mentions that was their occupation and their ancestors' occupation. So what that means to me is that we basically can rule out most of the Ivri history, the Ivrim history, as being farmers. Essentially we can rule that out. So that would mean that you only have two particular epics of Jewish history left, if you want to call it that. Again, it depends on what the person is trying to claim. So if you're talking about Benei Yisrael, okay, well now we'd have to find something that tells us that they went from being shepherds to farmers, or partially shepherds, partially farmers, in some significant way, to where you would be able to identify them as being from Yadava, a portion of India, and nowhere else. And this goes into the whole idea, also as I mentioned before, that the only way to make this claim is you'd have to say the Jews don't understand the Hebrew language. They never did, and they don't today. That only someone who understands an English translation, a Christian English translation, by the way, understands what the text means correctly. But Jews, they don't understand the text. So let's look at this point, and I'm going to focus mainly initially on the idea of them recalling watermelons and cucumbers to prove out that they were farmers. Because again, this person's claim is that they became farmers in Goshen. Now we know from the text that that's not completely true, and we also know that by recalling watermelons and cucumbers doesn't make you a farmer. And then the rest of the points they make don't have any connection to this farming issue. I mean, they're just putting things there. So we'll talk about that maybe on another video. So let's address this issue of a group of people who were from who made their way from Canaan to a place called Mitzrayim, which we discussed in the previous video in terms of its location. We showed that historically speaking, everybody agrees that Mitzrayim is Egypt. It's not somewhere in India. At some point I'll probably get into the geography problems that would be in claiming that it's India of using the Hebrew text. And again, this is not to try to prove a religious point. This is dealing with something that's just basically historical. So let's deal with this issue of farming simply because of the mention of watermelons and cucumbers. Okay, so in the Torah, the first thing we have to deal with is recalling watermelons and cucumbers, as this person wrote it, meaning I guess because it's mentioned in the Torah, watermelons and cucumbers, does that make someone a farmer just because it's mentioned in a text? Also according to the Hebrew text, who was recalling what? Meaning that the recalling of watermelons and cucumbers, well, who was doing the recalling? Can we specifically say it was Ivrim, Benei Yisrael, Yehudim, or could have been someone else doing the recalling? None of these statements address the evidence that the Torah is describing Yadava farmers. Again, recalling watermelons doesn't mean you're from Yadava. It doesn't mean you're a farmer. And also, one of the things we want to talk about is, so now we see that there's an agreement that the early period of the Ivrim were not farmers and they were actually shepherds. So we see that there's an agreement on that. And also, the last thing I would say is putting blood on a doorpost doesn't make one a farmer, let alone a Yadava. So maybe we'll get into that in another video of why that would be significant. So let's take what the Torah says. So in Bimidbar Yud Aleph Dalet, which in English you would call it Numbers 11:4, there's a particular statement that's made here that a group of people known as the Waho Asafsuf started a kind of a claim, because they wanted certain things that they remembered in Mitzrayim, and that it even influenced Benei Yisrael into saying initially the claim was that we want meat. Who's going to feed us meat? Now the next thing that happens when you go to verse 5 is it says Zacharnu et hadoho asher nochel b'Mitzrayim chinom en hakishuim et ha'avdachim. Now what's interesting about this is that the word ha'asaf is understood in Hebrew by Torah-based Jews to be the mixed multitude, meaning the people who had attached themselves to the Benei Yisrael when they were leaving Mitzrayim, from different cultures that were in Mitzrayim at the time, seeing an advantage. And then according to a number of Jewish sources, that this included certain people who were in the leadership of Mitzrayim, who saw the writing on the wall and saw how bad things were going, including some of the advisors to Paro, who kind of said, okay, well the advantage is with these Benei Yisrael, let's go with them. Now, what's interesting about this claim, that's what I have marked in the green, is that it mentions that they, the complaint that was being made here by this Asaf was essentially that they had, been eating, either what you could call squash or cucumbers and watermelons in Egypt. Now, the word kishuim in modern Hebrew is usually a type of squash, but it's also understood in ancient times to be cucumber, and that they were also eating watermelons. But it never says that they were farming them. It just says that they were eating them. So it says nochal b'Mitzrayim. Nochal b'Mitzrayim is what we used to eat in Mitzrayim, according to Rav Sadia Gaon. But there's nothing here that claims that this is ever being farmed. And also, if you think about it, I mean, these are kind of byproducts that are more like were considered certain delicacies, for like people who would have more power to be able to get their hands on something like this. But it never mentions farming. Now, just to kind of clear things up, because I assume the next claim would be that the only place you could find basically watermelons and cucumbers would have been in India. I kind of get the impression that's where the claim might be going. But if you look in Egyptian history, you find that essentially different types of melons, different types of watermelon, and also different types of cucumbers, have been found in ancient Egypt, in terms of different like tombs and things like that. Also in hieroglyphics, there's different, melons as well as cucumbers that are depicted in certain hieroglyphs. And further to that, DNA testing shows that there's the origins of watermelons, that there's a significant wild watermelon growth that has happened in different parts of East Africa, and in those areas. So again, I imagine the claim would be that all watermelons and cucumbers are only in India or something like that. But you find them in different parts of the world, and it's depicted in a number of places in Egyptian hieroglyphics. So if you go to a website called Watermelon Times, it deals with the history of watermelon's backstory. It's called Watermelon's Backstory Has Deep Roots. So I'll let you kind of read the article for yourself, and you can even pause it at this point. But this gives the history that I was describing earlier, that watermelons, were something that was, common in ancient Egypt and was considered a delicacy. Further to that, you see hieroglyphics from Egypt depicting watermelons. So this is not some foreign food, it was there, and it didn't require someone to be a farmer to basically to remember it or to mention it. Also, the same is true for cucumbers. That there was cucumbers that were evident in hieroglyphics in ancient Egyptian culture. Now, getting back to the point of the issue of shepherds. Now, one of the things that's interesting is if you look at the parts of the Torah that mentions the Benei Yisrael leaving Mitzrayim, one of the first things it mentions is that they left with son la mishpachtechem. That essentially when Moshe Rabbeinu, called them to be able to do the Pesach, one of the things he mentions is to take from your flocks and do a shechita on them, and this would be Pesach. Now, what's has to be noted is that the description of what they would take with them still mentions having flocks. So it mentions that they had flocks, and just like the person admitted, that they were, still shepherds at this point. But again, the claim is that they were farmers, but nothing here gives the impression that farming was some huge thing that you could use to identify them, let alone identify them from the Yadava region. Because again, when it mentions later in the Torah when they were leaving Mitzrayim, still mentions that they were bringing with them son of Akar. So this means that for example, predominantly they were still maintaining the act of being vro'ait son, basically being shepherds. And that when a person wants to identify, okay, well, these were Yadava farmers, well, again, if immediately the claim goes away or has to be reduced, just because someone can show from the text that there's no mention of them ever being farmers, that kind of shows the weakness of the claim. Now, the next debunk is going to be concerning linguistics. This is going to be Ivrit versus Sanskrit, because if you're talking about Yadava, from what I understand about it, the Sanskrit, is the one of the languages, I guess, the script that's used there, as well as the language there is a language that I will show is foreign to Hebrew itself, and I'll do it by doing it from a different direction. So what I suggest is the following. Don't take my word for it because I'm not an expert in Sanskrit, but there's a website that I found on YouTube that deals with learning Sanskrit for beginners. And I suggest that you go to this site. You can easily look up the name there and essentially listen to the first, I would say, first 5 videos, but focus on video 1 that you see at the top and also, video 5 at the bottom. Listen to the way that Sanskrit sounds, look at the script itself, and then compare it to one of the scripts, which I'll say is important to use kind of as a side note. Again, let's just put the Jewish side of it to the side and go by the Samaritans, the Shomoronim. Now, those of you who don't know Hebrew, you may have a hard time finding this website, but this is a YouTube channel. It's a Shomoroni person here in Israel who's explaining the ins and outs of how the Shomoroni language works. Now here I would, it's in Hebrew, so for those of you who don't know Hebrew, I would just say listen to it. Take the Sanskrit video where the woman is teaching how to speak Sanskrit and to read it, what the consonant sounds like, and then take it and compare it to this. And see if you find like that this sounds exactly the same, because what you would figure is if we're talking about ancient Ivrim and Benei Yisrael and Yehudim and even Shomoronim being Yadava, people from Yadava, from India, you would find some linguistic connection between the writing of Hebrew as well as Sanskrit, whether it be ancient Hebrew or Ashuri Hebrew, any of these things, which you don't find. So concerning the next debunk, which I'll be addressing here, is concerning Mitzrayim and early Ivrim. One of the things I suggest, continuing this issue. This part of this is going back to the previous video. Is I suggest that you look at any relevant information concerning Egypt in the name Mitzrayim and see if you can find anything that gives any kind of resolution that makes it seem as if everybody's confused over where Mitzrayim is. Look at the Armarana, the tablets, things like that. But what you'll find is the same thing I posted in the previous video, that you'll find in a number of Middle Eastern languages that the word Mitzrayim, Mitzir, Metzer, Musar is used to describe Mitzrayim, to describe Egypt. Further to that, you'll find things that are very similar to things in the Torah, like this particular stone that was found that has a description of a 7-year famine that took place in Mitzrayim, and that one particular official was able to lead the country through that situation. And again, we could debate about who that is and whether it's connected directly to the Torah, but again, it's not like there's nothing at all there that says there's no evidence whatsoever. The same way that there are papyrus that they find that have names that are basically names from the Torah, or names of Jews, or Benei Yisrael, or Ivrim, or Yehudim. And again, you could argue about that too, but at least you find something there that you could say we could debate about that. That draws a connection. And we also know that there was a sizable Jewish community in Mitzrayim going back several thousand years ago that is undisputed. And they called the place Mitzrayim. They didn't call it something else. Let's kind of bring this video to a close. As I mentioned before, if we want to get really silly with this, let's just simply do this. Let's say that India is actually where modern day Egypt is, where everybody thinks it is, and that Egypt is actually in India. Let's just switch the names and just go silly with it. If we can make these kind of huge, assumptions and jumps in logic, we might as well just say we can turn the whole map around. Maybe India is actually on Mars. This is of course, the claim that, if something, it contradicts, completely contradicts, what it is that I'm, making a hypothesis about. And I just have to defend that hypothesis no matter what, even in the face of contradiction without any evidence whatsoever. Then anything, everything's game. I could just change this map around and say, okay, well, Africa's not Africa. Africa is actually China. China is Europe. Why not just go full blown silly with it if that's, where we want to go? And again, what I suggest, like I suggested in the previous video, look up these videos here. Look at the Jews who actually lived in India. See what their history is. And see if it sounds anything like the claim that they were Yadava farmers. Because if anybody would know about India, it would be, and about the Jewish side of it, being Jewish and being from India, it'd be the Jews of India. So if the Jews of India are not saying that they're Yadava farmers or their ancestors were not Yadava farmers, then you can kind of discredit someone who wants to kind of like make up something and, will stand strong on this hypothesis without any evidence to support it, or evidence that they kind of just pull out of anywhere and make up and try to connect in ways that doesn't make any sense to anyone. So this is a Havever from the Chronicles of Havever, and there'll probably be another part to this, or Addendum part 2 or something to this one. Take care and bye.